Hello, I am Ron Herzman. I'm speaking to you from Geneseo, New York. This is my home office, but SUNY Geneseo is my home campus, and I'm here, not here, with Bill Stephany.
And I'm Bill Stephany at my home office. I'm in Burlington, Vermont, actually South Burlington, Vermont. And after a career of teaching at the University of Vermont, I'm now emeritus. Like Ron, I taught Dante basically throughout my entire career, and it culminated in some magic way in our teaching together, Ron and I, 15 different NEH seminars for school teachers in Siena, which is kind of a high point of what we did in our teaching careers. And here we are in Canto 27. We're in the Malebolge, just to set ourselves where we are in the poem. This is not necessary for people familiar with the poem, but there'll be some people who are less familiar. The Malebolge, the 10 areas in Dante's hell, which are devoted to the sin of fraud, very far removed down below the sins of self-indulgence and violence, carried down by Gerion. And I would just emphasize that I don't think there's a kind of a progression that each of the 10 areas is worse than the one before, but here we are fairly deep in the 8th of them. And the connections are more thematic than graduated. In this case, what we have is a clear diptych. Cantos 26 and 27 both are the same sin, not identified until the end of 27, where a double identifies their sin as fraudulent counsel, consiglio fraudolente. But I think there's a lot of other cantos that get touched in here. The first canto has a kind of introductory nature, pandering and seducing. We may get around to talking about the way in which the characters here, especially Boniface VIII, are involved in both pandering and seducing. The last canto has a kind of summary effect. If the first Malebolge has to do with an intro, the last Malebolge is a kind of summary of falsification, where we're at least falsifying persons and words, 2 of the 4 categories there, where Guido da Montefeltro is, you could say, pretending to be a Franciscan, and you could maybe even push the point and say that Boniface is pretending to be a pope. At least the Colonna cardinals would think so. And the falsification of words is obviously something that Boniface is engaged in. And finally, this is pretty clearly the second shoe dropping about simony, which is the main point of Canto 19. Canto 19 presents simony in a more objective way. Canto 27 presents us with a straightforward example of simony in action.
So one of the things that also helps to set the stage for this canto, one of the things that makes it particularly important, is that it really does become a kind of test case on what gets people to hell in the first place. One of the things that I do when I'm teaching the poem is that I ask students what you need to be a member of Dante's afterlife, subheading hell. And they usually get the first part right. You need to be dead. The second part they get pretty easily. You got to be dead by 1300. But then invariably they would say, you have to be a sinner to be in hell. And I would say, right on. The problem with that, though, is that the folks in purgatory and the folks in paradise have also been sinners. And so what differentiates hell from the other parts of the afterlife is the fact that these folks are sinners who are unrepentant. And that makes this a particularly interesting and important canto, because it really does have an interesting take on the very mechanics of repentance itself. We've got the story told by Guido de Montefeltro of essentially what he would like us to believe is a conversion experience. The fact that he was self-proclaimed here a sinner, decides that the end of his life is looking pretty close, and he, at least so he tells us, plans to make a conversion, and then called back to his evil ways by no less than the Pope himself. And here, once again, you have a very interesting take on the mechanics of hell, because it turns out that in almost all of the really dramatic cantos, the ones where there is really very extended conversation between Dante and one of the pilgrims. I'm sorry, one of the condemned folk down there. There's always a turn towards self-justification that relies on blaming something or somebody else. Early on, Francesca da Rimini famously blames love, and then a little bit later on in the same canto, she blames a book. When we get down here, a lot deeper in hell, in a way, what happens is that this Guido de Montefeltro has the best excuse of all, or so he would have us believe. He tells us that it was the Pope who made him do it. And so the interchange there, when he tells us about the Pope and the Pope's wily ways, is a really interesting exercise in reading, because what we have to do is sort of sort through what this tells us both about the Pope and about Guido himself. And I think that Bill and I would have you see that careful reading shows that neither of them wind up looking any good from the point of view of Dante, the poet, and of course, from what ought to be our point of view.
And that may be a good point at which to look at a specific passage. I'm looking at lines 67 and following. This is when Guido introduces himself and his conversion. Guido was, just to say a quick background, make a quick background point, he was a great 13th century Ghibelline warrior, that is to say a defender of empire. As early as 1248, when the great Emperor Frederick II was still alive, Frederick named him the leader, military leader of Forli and Faenza, and his career continued ever after, fighting primarily against the Guelph forces in support of the Pope. So you can see where the kind of animosity to the papal point of view comes from. And then late in life, he has this conversion experience that he describes here. So starting at line 67, I guess it is. Io fumi uom d'arme, e poi fui cordeliero, credendomi, sì cinto, fare amenda. E certo, io creder mio venia intero, se non fossi il gran prete, a cui mal prenda, che mi rimise nelle prime colpe, e come e qua re voglio che mi intenda.
So to do that in English and going a little bit further, I was a man of arms and then I was a Franciscan, believing so girt to make amends, and surely my belief would have been fulfilled had it not been for the high priest, may evil take him, who put me back on my first sins. And how, and qua re, I wish you to hear from me. When I was the form of flesh and bones that my mother gave me, my works were not those of a lion, but of a fox. The tricks and hidden ways, I knew them all, and I so plied their art that the fame of it went out to the ends of the earth. When I saw that I had reached that part of my life where every man should lower the sails and coil the rope, what earlier pleased me then grieved me, and I gave myself up, and repentant and shriven, and oh, miserable wretch that I am, and it would have worked. Well, there's a lot of charged language there, and I think that we're going to spend a little bit of time unpacking it all.
It's such a fun passage. I think the last thing that he says there requires, I think, looking at the note that you'll find in any Dante annotated text. It's a significant one. It's an important one. When Dante wrote the Convivio, some point earlier than this, he had thought that the conversion of Guido was a great example of somebody making a change of heart. So I'll read the translation here from the Zerilli-Martinez text, but you can find it in basically in any text. It's from Convivio, the fourth tractate. O miserable and vile you that run toward this port yet, with sails aloft, and because of the driving force of the wind are shattered where you should find rest, you yourselves losing which you had traveled so far to obtain. Surely the knight Lancelot did not wish to enter port with raised sails, nor did our own most noble Latin knight Guido of Montefeltro. these noblemen did well to find the sails, to furl the sails of earthly activity. In their old age, they surrendered to religion, setting aside all worldly pleasures and works. Well, Guido picks right up on that nautical imagery in the passage that Ron just read. And the way he presents it is almost like an example of his foxiness. While I was a form of flesh and a bone and flesh that my mother gave me, my works were not those of a lion, but a fox. The tricks and hidden ways, I knew them all, and I so applied the art that the fame of it went out to the ends of earth. It's almost like you could put a colon there. For example, he wouldn't mean that, but I think we hear it that way in the way it's presented by Dante poet. When I saw that I had reached that part of my life where every man should lower the sails and coil the ropes, what earlier pleased me then grieved me, and I gave myself up repentant and shriven. It would have been enough. And so what you have is somebody who, using the tricks of the fox, comes up with this story about how he's converting. And yes, he's a very clever, foxy person. He even tricked Dante.
And of course, the implication is that if this works, he's going to be able to do the ultimate scam and trick God as well. I got the Franciscan robe, I got the Franciscan cord. What else do you need? So, with that as a kind
of... He said earlier, but I was a man of arms, and then I was a Franciscan, believing so girt to make amends. And surely my belief would have been fulfilled. All I don't need belief. I just need belief in the fact that I put the right clothes on. Yeah. I didn't necessarily change my heart, I just changed my clothes.
And so, having changed his clothes, but not his heart, it's interesting to see how he presents this as this terrible thing that the Pope did by dragging him back into his old profession, something that he never would have thought of on his own. And indeed, the way he presents it, it's certainly true that Boniface does not come out looking very good at all. But the fact is that he was ripe for the picking. And it also turns out that in all of this sort of revelation that he's giving us about what an evil, nasty person Boniface is, he's also, in a sense, indicting himself for being a kind of a dummy here. Because what Boniface does is present him with an offer that he can't refuse. Again, this is the way he tells the story. I couldn't do this, Boniface. After all, I've converted. No problem, says Boniface. I will give you the ultimate get out of jail free card. I will give you absolution in advance so that the sin that you're about to commit, don't worry about it. It's forgiven already. And then Boniface makes the claim that because he's Pope, because he holds the keys, he's able to do that. Well, I think Dante wants us to examine that fairly carefully.
And specifically, he has the keys. Heaven I can lock and unlock, as you know. For that reason, the keys are two which my predecessor did not prize. His predecessor, of course, is Celestine V. And in fact, it was Celestine V, during his very brief 5-month papacy, who's the person who lifted the excommunication against Guido de Montefeltro. So it's a reminder that what one pope can do through his own executive order, I can undo with mine. It's a sort of argument. And that the echo of Constantine and Sylvester takes you right back, among other places, to Inferno 19. It begins, "O Simon Magus," and spoken by the poet, and ends with the pilgrim saying, "Ai Constantine, O Constantine, how terrible was the gift that you gave to the papacy." And here at line 94, "But as Constantine asked Sylvester in Soracte to cure him of leprosy, so he asked me to teach him to recover from this proud fever." An event that leads with that concludes with the baptism of Constantine prior to the donation of Constantine, but his baptism to wash away his sins. And here you have the focus on washing away in both henceforth I absolve you, and then just to make sure that, do we have these terms straight? I mean, we're dealing here with some sort of transactional business. You're saying that you're forgiving me. then his weighty arguments impelled me. This is down at line 106. For silence seemed to me the worst course, and I said, Father, since you wash me of that sin into which I must fall, a long promise with a short keeping will make you triumph on your high throne. I would underscore the word deggio, must. He doesn't have to fall. It's a quick skip around free will to say, look, since I have to commit this sin, here's how you do it. You are going to forgive me, right?
Yeah. So this transactional analysis between the two of them, could sort of look at it as two mafia dons sitting over a cup of coffee in some little club in Queens, figuring out how to do this. And what happens is that he gives Boniface advice that allows Boniface to basically trick and therefore capture his enemies, the Colonna Cardinals and their forces, who were holed up in the city of Palestrina. And basically, he says, look, it's really quite simple. All you have to do is promise them that it's all over, grant them an amnesty, and then when they sort of throw down their swords and their lances and come out, just zap them all, just arrest them, which is, in point of fact, what actually happened. Now, it's kind of interesting there that what he is asking Boniface to do, or rather what he's telling Boniface is going to work, turns out to be a pretty slimy strategy, and Boniface obviously has no problem at all accepting it. But the implications of what Guido says, long promise and short fulfillment, turn out to be one of the great ironic lines in the entire poem, because they certainly apply to the speaker himself, to Guido. If the promise was long, eternal life, it's a pretty short fulfillment, because after he dies, he's taken off to hell by a demon who sort of intercepts his flight to heaven. So that there's just one of the niftiest ironies that you could ever hope for in Guido's failing to see the obvious, starting with the fact that as a Franciscan, he's done Theology 101. He must know that forgiveness in advance is a logical impossibility.
And there's also, within Dante's own poem, a wonderful internal commentary upon this line. Long promise with short keeping, lunga promessa con l'attender corto. When you get to Canto 25 of Paradiso, in the Canto on hope, the definition of hope, straight out of the textbook, is lunga promessa con l'attender certo, a certain fulfillment rather than the corto fulfillment. And it's a reminder in Canto 25, you think back to this, that what we're dealing with is a violation of hope. The two ways that you can violate hope are through despair and through presumption. And at least that's the traditional scholastic take on it. And what we're dealing with here is a gross act of presumption that if the Pope gives me forgiveness, that's enough for me.
And of course, there's also another wonderful level of irony with that long promise and short fulfillment. One of the things that happens in his conversion, of course, is that he makes a promise. He takes vows as a Franciscan. And how long did that last? So that the line can refer to his, if you will, short career as a Franciscan as well. Another really wonderful level there. And so notice that one of the things that it's doing, all of the ways in which it condemns Boniface are true, and as Bill suggested, really link up with all of the things that Dante has to say about simony in Inferno 19. But there's an extra delicious addition to that when it's a really bad guy who is telling us just how bad Boniface is. And that's something I think that we also need to take into account in looking at the many layers here of speaker's voice when you have Guido speaking in the voice of Boniface himself.
You have at the beginning of Canto 19, the poet saying, O Simon Mago, at the end of the canto, the pilgrim saying, Ais Constantine, and here a character within the poem condemning a Simoniac pope. There's one other word that I'd like to focus on in that passage that we read earlier at line 71. Had it not, everything would have been fine had it not been for the high priest, may evil take him, who put me back into my first sins. Che mi rimise nelle prime colpe. The word sums up the problem. That's not the way remission is supposed to happen. In the sacrament of penance, you're supposed to have a remission of your sins, not a remission to your sins, which is what's happening here. He sent me not away from my sins, but he sent me nelle prime colpe, back to my first sins.
So it's kind of neat to see that from our somewhat distant vantage point to look and see how enormously relevant the whole interchange is in terms of what happens really when you're acting simply in a transactional way without any reference to first principles whatsoever. He's talking about how, Boniface didn't see that his vows made anything different about his situation. Well, of course, that's what he's ripe for in the first place. And of course, Boniface, here as in Inferno 19, the implication is that Boniface's spiritual powers are being used totally for his own political and, in fact, military interests, and that they are simply one more weapon in his arsenal. And it seems to me that that's something for us to ponder. It's as valuable a thing to think about today as it was then.
It's as though what Boniface says, in effect, is you spent your whole life using your foxy wiles against the papacy, but now you're on our side. You've converted. Conversion doesn't mean a change of heart. It means you change sides. You're on my team now. Use the same old skills that you've been using against me to show me how to do what I need.
And of course, that works for Boniface himself, because Boniface was no great fan of the Franciscans, but all of a sudden there's this Franciscan who can help him out in a big way, and he's perfectly willing to use him for his own purposes. So the combination is really quite devastating, and Dante just draws it out so wonderfully, so brilliantly.
I'll say one last thing about the Sicilian bull, which is back at line 7. It introduces the whole canto, and in a sense is an introduction to many of the ideas that we've been talking about, many of the themes in the canto. And the Sicilian bull, of course, is made by the Athenian craftsperson Perillus, who makes it for Valerius, the Agrigento tyrant. You make a bull, you put a person in it that you're going to execute. You light a fire underneath it, and the cries of the person being roasted alive reverberate around the inside of the bull and finally come out sounding like the bull's bellowing, a horrifying kind of torture device, which was first used successfully on Perillus himself, the Sicilian bull's deviser. As the Sicilian bull, which first bellowed with the cries of him, and that was right, who had tempered it with his file, used to bellow with the voice of the afflicted one, so that, though made of brass, still it seemed transfixed with pain. So, not having any path or outlet from its origin within the fire, the anguished words were converted into its language. But after they had found their way up to the tip, imparting to it that wriggling which the tongue had given them in their passage, we heard it say, "Oh, you to whom I direct it." So if you take away the subordinate clauses, it says, as the Sicilian bull used to bellow with the voice of the afflicted one, so not having any path, the voice came up here. So what it's showing us is the way in which the voice from within at first just sounds like incomprehensible moaning, but then as it eventually makes its way up through the flame, remember that these are people who are completely enclosed within flames. This is the same way that in Canto 26, Ulysses and Diomedes were, and all the other people who looked like flames walking down the gullet of the Malebolgia. It makes its way up, and then finally the tip of the tongue starts shaking as the words that are being spoken within, which at first just sounded reverberating like the bellowing of a bull, starts making the tongue move and indicate these words. It's appropriate that the first person to have suffered it was just, it was right, was the person who had tempered it with his file. Of course, it's like the deceiver deceived, the beguiler beguiled, the trickster tricked. It's what happens in the Canto to the great deviser of strategies, Guido da Montefeltro. But also when you're waiting up, the words are finally going to come up. What is it finally that he's going to want to say? He finally gets the words out, and it's what's happening politically in Romagna, not what's happening to the Franciscans. It tells you right away where his heart lies. And as Capaneus says in Canto 14, it's sort of a summary line for everybody in Inferno. What I was living, I am dead. It's a reminder that what you find in the characters in Dante's tale is not that God's punishing them. That's too simple. It's not that these people are being punished by some sadistic God. The punishments in hell are not punishments, they're revelations. They're indications of the habit of thought that these people had, the habit of action these people had throughout their lives, reenacted for eternity. Yeah. So that the reality of their socially, personally, psychologically, sinfully inappropriate behavior gets reenacted forever in a way that, because of its metaphorical nature, we can recognize in a way that we might not have recognized without. He's contained within this tongue of fire, a kind of anti-Pentecostal reference, using his tongue not the way Franciscans might be expected to, but in a deceptive